All right, thanks for your patience, folks. At this time, I would like to turn things over to Professor Mark Rush, the Director of International Education, and the Stanley D. and Nikki Waxberg Professor of Politics here at WNL, to give the introduction for tonight's guest speaker and topic. Mark, I'm going to throw the spotlight over to you, and feel free to start.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I am Mark Rush, Professor of Politics and Law here, Director of the Center for International Ed, and most important, I get to introduce our Constitution Day speaker, Dr. Marianne Franks, excuse me, of the University of Miami Law School. Dr. Franks' many accolades are too numerous to address appropriately in a short intro. So let me just give a little bit of a background and some comments on the talk tonight. She took a bachelor's degree from Loyola University in New Orleans. She is a Rhodes Scholar and took both an M and D Phil from Oxford. She took her JD from Harvard Law, and she is president and legislative and technology policy director of the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative. That's a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating online abuse and discrimination, and really a powerful voice for the victims of hate speech, revenge porn, and so forth. It's really a fantastic organization, a fantastic endeavor. Dr. Franks is currently working on a new book project called Fearless Speech. This succeeds her current book, or her first book, The Cult of the Constitution, which is also the topic and title of tonight's speech. I was introduced to Dr. Franks as a result of reading the book. I had the pleasure of reading it, writing a review about it, and was just absolutely taken by it. It's a passionate statement about the state of First and Second Amendment freedoms and interpretations in the United States. It's a thought-provoking critique and analysis of the notion of the marketplace of ideas in Western liberal political thought, and also how technology has radically altered that and is forcing us to rethink the parameters of that marketplace metaphor. And finally, it's a powerful analysis of the clash between the individual exercise of civil liberties and the protection of the civil rights of those against whom sometimes civil liberties can be exercised. Really, it's a fantastic book. Any good book should have you thinking so much that you maybe even get a headache, that you've dog-eared, highlighted, scribbled all over the book, and really taken a beautiful book and tattered it with your thinking and responses. And this is the sort of book it is. And I would recommend it to anyone with an interest in the Constitution or contemporary debates about law and politics today. On that note, and without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, our Constitution Day speaker for 2020, Dr. Marianne Franks.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for that really generous introduction. And it is really a pleasure and an honor to be here to speak to you on Constitution Day. I think it's appropriate for any Constitution Day lecture, perhaps, but especially given the title of my particular lecture, to reflect on what the Constitution Day celebration is meant to be. So as many of you likely know, Constitution Day is meant to celebrate the signing of the Constitution, September 17th, 1787. The reason why it's celebrated at virtually every institute of higher learning across the country is because Congress has mandated that it be so. There was a federal statute passed in 2004 that obligates any educational institution that receives federal funds, which is almost all of them, to have some sort of program, some sort of event for Constitution Day. And it is a very interesting opportunity to think about what it means that our sort of proposition for the day, the Constitution Day lecture, the whole idea of it is a federally mandated attempt to revere the Constitution and to reflect upon it. But I'll take that opportunity to reflect on the Constitution and to reflect on where I'm giving the talk, not literally, of course, but at least in this virtual sense of giving it to Washington and Lee University, which of course has been in the spotlight for any number of reasons lately, not least because of its name and because of some of the courses that are taught at the university. It seems very appropriate for this to be a place that we have a conversation about what it means to honor the Constitution, who it protects, who is considered to be legitimate in invoking its protections, and what does it mean, what should it mean for us to honor the Constitution going forward. So I want to talk about the demonstration or the event, the historical event that opens my book This was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. I want to talk about why it was that I used that particular event as the opening for my book. And I want to talk about what I thought the spectacle at Charlottesville really showed us about the Constitution. And then I want to talk about what's happened since then. I want to talk about a demonstration that has happened somewhat more recently. That is the demonstration, the Black Lives protest that took place in Kenosha, Wisconsin, 3 years later, just a few weeks ago, and the violence that erupted there, and talk about what has not changed, what has changed, and what that means for the future of the Constitution and the future of the country. So as I'm sure everyone remembers, the events of Charlottesville, 2017, you had hundreds of white men, almost exclusively white and male demonstrators marching through Charlottesville, chanting Nazi slogans and also chanting, "You will not replace us." And we remember too that the next day there were many more of these demonstrators, that they occupied Emancipation Park, and that there were several violent clashes that then broke out between counter-protesters and the demonstrators. We know, for instance, that there was a man who fired a gun into a crowd of people. We know that there were 6 men who were beating a young African-American man in a parking garage. We know that 2 state troopers died when the helicopter they were using to monitor the demonstration crashed. And of course, we know that one of the far-right demonstrators at Charlottesville drove his car into a crowd of unarmed protesters and killed a young woman named Heather Heyer. What we also know is that in the aftermath of Charlottesville, there was an extraordinary amount of public commentary about what it meant for the country. And what was extraordinary to think about now is that in the days after the events at Charlottesville, there were figures all across the political spectrum who went out of their way to say, this is not who we are. That the events of Charlottesville were roundly condemned, not just by those on the left, but by many people on the right, including people like Virginia Republican Thomas Garrett, Paul Ryan, Rand Paul, John McCain, and others, who all use some version of the sentiment of how the founding fathers and the Constitution does not tolerate this type of hatred, does not tolerate this kind of expression of white supremacy. For instance, John McCain said in a statement that our founders fought a revolution for the idea that all men are created equal. White supremacists and neo-Nazis are by definition opposed to American patriotism and the ideals that define us as a people and make our nation special. One particular prominent voice, however, that did not seem as keen to condemn what happened at Charlottesville was, of course, President Trump, who infamously noted that there were good people on both sides. Why it was that I chose Charlottesville as the opening for the book was perhaps not evident simply based on these news accounts. What I argued was that the very signs that might have seemed positive about the aftermath of Charlottesville, that is that almost unanimous condemnation of the events by the political mainstream, that in fact was a flawed way of looking at what happened in Charlottesville, that contrary to those sentiments about how what happened in Charlottesville were not who we are, in fact, the events of Charlottesville were very much who we are, and we're very much entangled in our conception of what the Constitution protects, and maybe more specifically, who the Constitution protects. And my argument was that what Charlottesville actually did show us is that the concept of white male supremacy and the Constitution are inextricable. They are not reducible to one another, but they are inextricable. And the way that I outlined this in the book is to take apart what I saw as the key components of how we got to Charlottesville. And in particular, thinking about the role that a very specific version or vision of the First Amendment and the Second Amendment played in the events that unfolded in Charlottesville. First, the public safety matters and the question of why the rally happened to begin with and happened where it did and how it got so quickly out of control. One of those reasons, according to city officials and state officials, was the place where the rally took place. So the argument was on the part of state officials that it should not happen in Emancipation Park because it was too hard to control. And this was something that had been decided based on the welfare of the people of Charlottesville. But the leader of the Charlottesville rally was able to enlist the help of the ACLU, which argued that trying to say that the protest couldn't be located where he wanted it to be located was a violation of the First Amendment. So there was a very specific, very particular use and invocation of the First Amendment to allow the rally to happen where it did. At the same time, the kinds of people who were able to come to the rally and the kinds of things they were able to bring with them, the way that the First Amendment was invoked as a means of emphasizing the freedom of speech nature of a rally and demonstration was complicated by the fact that so many of these speakers showed up not only with Confederate flags and swastikas, but also with weapons, visible weapons that were clearly designed to intimidate the people that they encountered. When reflecting on what happened in Charlottesville, we think about, or we should think about, the convergence of those two elements, a very absolutist view of the First Amendment that says, regardless of all interests for the public or for safety, not only does certain speech have to be allowed, it has to be given the kind of platform that its speakers demand. In addition to that, the very concept of, or undermining the very concept of why freedom of speech is so valuable at all, which is to say, because speech is preferable to violence, was directly undercut by the use of open carry laws in Virginia to allow people to carry with them deadly weapons and have them visible during this protest. And if we think about why those two things can't really coexist, we ask ourselves how it is possible for anyone who is unarmed facing an armed person with a certain message, how likely is it that there is going to be genuine opportunities for counter speech and for the free exchange of ideas in those kinds of exchanges? The other factor that was at issue in Charlottesville had to do with the internet and the internet absolutism, or the cult of the internet that I argue we have also sustained in the United States, which essentially allows for all kinds of communication among people who intend to do harm, who organize protests, who organize and radicalize other white supremacists, who were able in the specific case to be able to reach each other, get greater numbers, and actually plan on strategies, including the use of weapons for intimidation and the strategy of potentially driving cars into protesters. My argument was that this is, in Charlottesville, a display of all of those cultic attachments to certain types of constitutionally infused ideas, freedom of speech, guns, and the internet as a kind of conflation of the view that speech is everywhere and that the internet allows us to do pure speech, that what happens on the internet is not harm, it is not real in some sense, and therefore cannot be regulated. And my argument is that that is the way that we got the spectacle that we got in Charlottesville, that what was essentially going on when people say, you cannot replace us, the claim really being made here was the Constitution's powers, its rights, its privileges, these are really for one group of people and one group alone, and that we will, through a show of force, make sure that everyone understands that that is the case. And when I use the term white male supremacy, I think it's very important to unpack what exactly is meant by those words. Unlike many of the invocations of the racism that was on display in Charlottesville, I have insisted on saying white male supremacy as opposed to merely just white supremacy, to highlight the fact that there's a deep connection between the racism and the sexism of the people who insist on this message that they were trying to promote in Charlottesville. And that this, unfortunately, is not a betrayal of the Constitution, but in some ways a remarkable sense of fidelity to the Constitution. And of course, what that then entails is a candid accounting of what the Constitution was actually designed to protect. And in the book, I go into some detail about the facts that most people know but may not have thought of from the perspective of equality, which is that, of course, the Constitution itself was written by white, wealthy men who quite deliberately and intentionally excluded from the Constitution's protections not only all women, but also non-white peoples. And of course, we know about the other so-called compromises of the Constitution, as it was the euphemism for slavery. We know that really and truly what the Constitution was about was a way to promote the idea of equality without actually putting it into practice. And that the legacy of that white male supremacy, the privileging of white male interests above all others, was part and parcel of that document. We can try to say that since that time, we've abandoned that legacy. This was very much the aftermath discussion of Charlottesville. Maybe that was true at the time. Of course, the founding fathers were somewhat flawed, but now the Constitution has worked itself pure. Unfortunately, that cannot be true either. If we look at the legacy of racism and sexism in this country, we see that we've never actually lost sight of white male supremacy, and it has never actually receded. What we have seen is that some accommodations have been made on behalf or due to the great efforts of brave people who have sacrificed everything to try to make the Constitution mean what it says. But what we've actually never seen happen in our historical time has ever been an end to the domination of white male interests. If we look at the administration, if we look at any industry, if we look at the military, if we look at education, if we look at business, if we look at entertainment or any other sector of society, we continue to see the legacy of white male domination. This is not a domination that has resulted from an equal playing field, but rather specific and dedicated attempts to make sure that women and non-white men have never been granted the equality or the access to rights that other people have. And what that means is we have a way of putting our tendencies, whether they are racist tendencies or sexist tendencies, we have a way of putting them into operation that actually lets people off the hook for the very things that they are demanding. Hence the invocation of the Constitution, the premise, the formal idea that we have equality, men and women are equal, all races are equal as well. What we have in practice, though, is invocations of the First and Second Amendments that isolate those amendments from the rest of the document and focus on the idea of free speech or the idea of weapons as if they can be taken apart from the consideration of community welfare, as if they can be taken apart from the consideration of who is getting to exercise those rights. So what we are told is that the Constitution, whether expressed in the First Amendment or the Second Amendment, the Constitution is something almost divine. It is something that cannot be contradicted. It is something that you either agree with or you are not a patriot. It is something that we are told is objective and eternal and somehow higher than all the rest of us. And it's that reason that my book is titled The Cult of the Constitution. And it's for that reason that I compare constitutional fundamentalism to religious fundamentalism. That same technique of looking at a scripture or taking some text, some idea, taking the parts of it that serve your interests, ignoring all the other parts of it, and trying to present that as some sort of authority that cannot be betrayed. So what we have with Second Amendment fundamentalists is the idea that guns are the most important thing. Self-defense is all that really matters, and that it is somehow above and beyond all the other rights that we have in the Constitution. And it's quite clear to see the fundamentalist tendencies in far-right Second Amendment, self-styled Second Amendment defenders, because they often do invoke religion and God and order and history in order to promote this idea that the Second Amendment is the most important part of the Constitution and really the rest of it doesn't matter as much. But as I argue in my book, it's not just the right-wing conservatives who are doing this to constitutional rights. Similarly, the First Amendment has been used by its self-styled defenders to simply dismiss the kinds of injuries and harms that might happen to vulnerable groups when we have a certain kind of commitment to freedom of speech. We are told, very much like the gun lobby tells us, forget about the deaths. The most important thing is that we have the right to self-defense. We're told by First Amendment absolutists, forget about all the injury that's caused by certain kinds of speech. Everything is a slippery slope. Everything that is put in the way of the full exercise of one of these amendments is going to mean the end of those rights. So you have the gun lobby and the Second Amendment defender saying, the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. You have First Amendment defenders saying the only thing that's going to stop bad speech is better speech. And in both cases, what happens is that the world that we live in continues to privilege white men's access to those rights and to those freedoms and privileges and tends to diminish everybody else's. And we're told over and over again by constitutional fundamentalists that that's just a coincidence, that these are just the way that the higher principles have worked out. But that cannot be true. Well, what has happened since Charlottesville? What has happened since what I was hoping would be a diagnosis of the spectacle that unfolded at Charlottesville? What we've seen happen since this time is that the idea of armed protest, as contradictory as it is, has become fully normalized. We've seen over and over again in open carry states, armed men demonstrating against laws that they don't like, politicians that they don't like, even the existence of certain legislative sessions. We've seen that people have been able to invoke the Second Amendment to justify those types of protests. In Richmond, for instance, as we saw not long ago, but all across the states, especially in light of the stay-at-home orders and the COVID pandemic. So we have increasing numbers of protesters who show up with weapons to express their disapproval over what they claim is a violation of their constitutional rights. People who endanger the welfare of other people, both through their weapons as well as through their the lack of precautions that they take in a time of the pandemic, and insisting upon their constitutional rights and their persecution and their sense that they have been inconvenienced to such an extent that we should think of it as a constitutional matter. But it's even worse than that. It's not simply the question of people invoking the Constitution for laws they don't like and orders that they find troubling. We've seen that in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, that there have been an increasing number of people who have shown up in order to commit violence against those very people who are trying to protest and use the First Amendment for themselves. So it is that we saw that in Wisconsin and Kenosha in August, 3 years after Charlottesville, we see that there are Black Lives Matter protests erupting over the shooting of yet another unarmed Black man. And we see that on the third night of the protest, a brand new Facebook group called Kenosha Guard starts an event titled Armed Citizens to Protect Our Lives and Property, which calls for people to show up armed to the courthouse, and it drew more than 2,000 expressions of interest. The group was created by a former Kenosha alderman who said that he formed it after concluding that law enforcement was outnumbered, and said, "I figured with citizens taking up arms, the epitome of the need for the Second Amendment, we wouldn't be outnumbered." It was simply, he said, a call to arms. Hey, if you're sick of your community burning down and you're a law-abiding citizen, take up arms and defend our community. It was a post that was flagged by users on Facebook at least 455 times, but Facebook took no action. And then one of the armed individuals who apparently found this message or this encouragement to be provocative was 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, who claims that he traveled to Kenosha from Antioch, Illinois to help defend the town. And on August 25th, he shot and killed 2 people during a clash with protesters. The difference is not just that this was more violence than we have seen in previous protests. It was also the reaction to the violence. In sharp contrast to the aftermath of Charlottesville, when politicians on the right and left rushed to condemn the actions, not only of the particular white supremacist who killed Heather Heyer, but also for the general sentiments of that protest. We had right-wing figures, politicians, and the president expressing their support for Kyle Rittenhouse, their support for the man who killed people at a protest. So to the extent that we have seen something change in the 3 years since Charlottesville, what we've seen is that the mask has come off. Things remain as terrible as they were, but there's even worse news. There are even fewer reasons, or at least fewer signs, that those who believe that the Constitution and this country belongs to white men, and that white men are entitled to take up violence in order to protect that. There's even fewer people who are willing to disavow that. Now it has become fairly open. And that is the world that we're left with today. We're left with a world in which the Constitution gets invoked or not invoked, depending on whether or not the people in power think of it as being good for their ends. We know that right now, we are living in an unprecedented time where hundreds of thousands of people are dead from a deadly illness. The unemployment rates are rocketing. We know that people are suffering from hunger and poverty. We know that entire parts of the country are on fire. We know that violence against men who are not white, we know that violence against women of any color, we know that all of these things run rampant. We see police brutality in the streets. We see people being put down when they have tried to rise up and speak about the problems in their society. We see all this, and we see that those in power are saying instead that it is their constitutional rights, white men's constitutional rights, that are truly under attack. And what are their priorities in a time of unprecedented tragedy and discrimination? The priorities are to crack down on teaching about slavery, about teaching about how to overthrow the government, about Black Lives Matter protests being acknowledged in any way other than to condemn them as dangerous thugs. We see that the real issues by those in power are to say we should stop teaching certain things. We should stop taking down statues. We should stop being critical about history. We should, in fact, see all of those things as violations, those forms of things, those protests, that criticism, that attempt by people who are not white, wealthy, or male, all of their attempts to speak up, all of their attempts to say the Constitution's promises are going unfulfilled, they are the problem. They are the ones who are threatening our Constitution today. So, is it possible for us to have a different way of looking at the Constitution? Because the status quo is only getting worse. The invocations of the Constitution and the protections that it is offered are truly becoming harder and harder to extricate with outright white male supremacy. Is there any way that we could have ever done differently or can do differently now? It is worth imagining what it would have been like if we had listened to other people who had wanted to dissent against the Constitution's false equality promises. If we'd ever listened, for instance, in 1787 to Abigail Adams, when she asked John Adams to consider what the tyranny was that men were trying to keep over women, even as they were trying to throw off the tyranny of the British government, and about the tyranny of slavery that they too were willing to compromise on. What would have happened if we had listened to any of the voices throughout history that have said, you cannot say we the people and not protect all of the people? What can we do in a time like this to actually honor the Constitution? What does it mean to do so? And I'd like to suggest that what it would mean is to, first of all, to grieve for all the people who have not been included in the Constitution's protections, to grieve for those people who have been lost either through death, through slavery, through the lack of access for their own potential, and to consider those who have done better or could do better, to consider what it means to stand up to power, to consider what it means to take a risk to be a dissenter when power gravitates in one certain direction for one certain group for so long. The Constitution is only ever about the people. And the Constitution, for better and for worse, means what people want to do with the Constitution. What we can do is to honor the dissenters. We can honor the people who have tried to make the Constitution better. We can honor the Me Too movement. We can honor the Black Lives Matter movement. We can honor the sacrifice and the suffering of everyone who's ever been excluded, because the First Amendment protects Me Too. The First Amendment protects the Black Lives Matter movement. The Second Amendment protects Philando Castile. The Second Amendment protects Marissa Alexander. The Constitution is for George Floyd. The Constitution is for Breonna Taylor. The Constitution is for accountability of power. It seems appropriate to think about what one of the founders themselves, George Washington, said about the nature of the Constitution and about the wisdom of the people who were putting the Constitution together. This is a time to reflect on the fact that when George Washington was thinking about what they had done and thinking about how the Constitution was going to be perceived and practiced throughout the ages, he noted, I think the people, and he says, it is for them to judge, can, as they will have the advantage of experience on their side, decide with as much propriety on the alterations and amendments which are necessary as ourselves. I do not think we are more inspired, have more wisdom, or possess more virtue than those who will come after us. And he was right. And so what we can do when we are thinking about honoring the Constitution is to celebrate those who did come after and who did do better. And I think when I think of those who came after and did do better, among the people I think of is Barbara Jordan from Texas on July 25th, 1974. And she opened her argument for impeaching President Nixon by reflecting on the preamble to the Constitution. Jordan was the first African-American congresswoman elected from the South. And she said, and she noted that when the words were written, she was not included in the Constitution's promise. But she said, through the process of amendment, interpretation, and court decision, I have finally been included in We the People. And she continued, my faith in the Constitution is whole. It is complete. It is total. And she vowed, I'm not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, the destruction of the Constitution, as she voted to impeach the president. She was echoed in some ways many years later, in December 2019, by Val Demings, the congresswoman from Florida, who wrote that she was a descendant of slaves and that she had not been protected by the laws. But she also noted in her remarks, she said, I come before you as an African-American female. I come before you as a descendant of slaves. I come before you proclaiming that in spite of America's complicated history, my faith is in the Constitution. And I say that today with perfect peace. I've enforced the laws, and now I write the laws, and I know that nobody is above the law. I think too of people like the late Congressman John Lewis, who left us with these words recently in an essay in July 2020. Democracy is not a state, it is an act, and each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. The Constitution is not divine, it is not fixed, it is not infallible. It is a deeply flawed document written by deeply flawed men, designed to exclude and exploit those who are not white, not wealthy, not male. But better men and women have since changed it, improved it, and have fought for it. And on this day, and on every day, we can make the choice to honor and emulate them, the ones who advocate for the vulnerable, the sick, the excluded, the exploited, the ones who risk their reputations and their safety and their lives to hold power accountable, those who dedicate themselves to the unfinished project of democracy and the unfulfilled promise of we the people, those who fight for community rather than a cult of the Constitution. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Franks. And to the audience, as Patrick indicated at the beginning, we welcome your questions. Please post them to the Q&A screen. We'll be able to see them there. We're just going to be passing them on to Dr. Franks as they come on in. I will take the moderator or host's privilege and ask the first question. I was really struck as you, at the beginning of your book, you talk about your childhood and your approach to the Constitution, religious scripture, so forth. And I was really struck by what I thought was a very straightforward and clear and understandable suggestion that you made, which is we ought to interpret rights in accordance with, say, the golden rule, categorical imperative, or whatnot. And I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate that a little bit and think about a court case or whatnot where if we had decided a little bit differently, it would manifest this in a way that would be productive.
Thank you for that. Yes, a lot of the book is spent talking about how I think in many ways, because as someone who grew up in Arkansas in the Southern Baptist tradition, I think of how differently certain parts of the Bible were emphasized. The parts that were sort of more Old Testament, the idea of vengeance, the idea of power, retaining power, were much more emphasized than the parts of the New Testament where the emphasis was on reciprocity and on forgiveness. And much, much later, when I became a constitutional scholar, it occurred to me that the 14th Amendment in some ways was the sort of New Testament of the Constitution, because it too comes later. It's an acknowledgement of the failings of what has come before. And it is an imperative to say that the least among you has got to be treated in the same way as the most powerful person, that is the only justifiable way to have a moral universe. And it's the only way truly to have a logical universe, that everything else is simply self-interest. That the test for us has always got to be, no matter how we put it, whether we want to talk about it in terms of the golden rule or reciprocity or the Kantian categorical imperative, the message is the same. The only test against our own selfish interests is whether or not we are willing to say that the thing we want, the thing that we believe that we are entitled to, is given to the person who doesn't look like us, who doesn't resemble us. And that conversely, anything that we desire not to happen to us, any exploitation or abuse or mistreatment that we would not want for ourselves, we cannot justify happening to someone else. And it does seem incredibly simple. And strangely enough, I think it is actually really simple. It's much harder to work out a theory and a practice of supremacy and subordination and domination. And yet somehow it's a lot easier for our society to do the more Old Testament way of looking at the world rather than the idea of equality and reciprocity and community.
Checking out our list of questions. I have, let me see, one here that asks, can you talk a bit more about how mass shootings have impacted your thoughts on the Second Amendment and its role in arming the people?
Yes, well, the role of the mass shootings that we've seen increasing in number, and not even just the question of just the number of people who have died in mass shootings, because it's still true today that the vast majority of gun violence is not a result of mass shootings. The vast majority of it is happening within homes. A lot of it is happening within context of domestic violence, but it is important always to keep in mind, for purposes of considering the public welfare, that it's not just the number of dead bodies, it's also the message that the public receives, the sense of chilling, right? In the First Amendment sense and in every sense, that when we don't feel as though we can go to church or to a movie theater, or our own schools, without fearing that someone might be able to start shooting at random and kill dozens of people, then something very fundamental happens to our sense of security and liberty. It's impossible for us to live freely in a society where we have to fear that kind of violence. And it isn't so much a matter of a question of how many happen in a year, it's a question of the fact that everyone has to worry about it now. And that the people who have to worry about it the most are the people who have always historically been the ones who are dismissed or trivialized as the victims of violence. And we have to worry too about the fact that this kind of violence now has taken on a complete new legitimacy, in the sense of getting presidential and other types of official encouragement for acts of violence against people who disagree with us or people that we don't like, combined with a massive, for lack of a better word, propaganda designed to dehumanize everyone who doesn't look like us or who doesn't agree with us. And so I'm very concerned about how that has changed the very fabric of how people can relate to each other, and very concerned about what I think was already the very precarious wisdom, if we want to call it that, of the 2010 or earlier decisions about the Second Amendment or any of the historical background, that we are not considering enough about how much mass shootings and the presence of this type of warfare among citizens, private citizens, chills speech and invades liberty. And it's my hope that if there's one lesson that can be taken away from the increased visibility of that kind of violence, is that we would consider just how much we are all being restricted in our abilities to express ourselves, to move about freely, because of gun violence in our society.
A question from another one of our students. I'm wondering if Dr. Franks has found any recent judicial or legislative successes in the defense of the constitutional rights of women and people of color, and she could identify some of them.
I wish there were more to speak of, and I will link that back to, I think, part of the question here that Professor Rush has asked me about the cases and whether there's places to think about how we can do this differently. And I think there's a few modest successes that we can think of. Personally, I have been somewhat involved in the legislative attempts to reform privacy law to protect the rights of those who are exploited through their private images. So a phenomenon that is popularly known as revenge porn, also known as non-consensual pornography. Part of the work that I do with the organization, the Cyber Civil Rights Initiative, is to try to advocate on behalf of women and other vulnerable communities that have been attacked in this way, and for whom these kinds of abuses have been defended by a very specific version of the First Amendment. And so one of the things we have tried to do is to encourage legislative reform for these matters. And that means passing laws that actually would protect people's rights not to be exploited in this way, and to counter the arguments that this is First Amendment protected speech by noting that privacy laws generally have done this for some time. That is, have taken certain types of private information and said that you can't just freely disclose those anytime you would like. We can't just freely disclose people's medical records. We can't freely disclose things like their social security numbers. And increasingly, there's now questions about whether or not people should be allowed to disclose biometric features of individuals. So what we have found is that we've gone from 3 states that had any kinds of laws that would have provided protections against this kind of abuse, due in part to our efforts at advocacy. We are now up to 48 jurisdictions that now have laws. They have been challenged occasionally on First Amendment grounds, and so far we've had success. Illinois' law was recently challenged, and Illinois Supreme Court decided that the law did not in fact violate the First Amendment, and made a very strong case for showing that privacy belongs to women too, and that in order to actually protect the privacy of women and other groups, we would need laws like this non-consensual pornography law to protect their freedoms of expression. Now that outcome, unfortunately, has been contested by the person who was suing to begin with, and it is now pending before the Supreme Court, which could possibly take it up. I don't think it likely will, but it could. And it's not the only one of those states that has come out in this direction. We've also seen rulings from Vermont, and we're waiting on a ruling in Minnesota for very similar issues. But so far, cautiously optimistic about how these laws will be seen as justifiably protecting the privacy and expression rights of women in particular, and that the First Amendment will not simply be used as a defense to justify any form of exploitation simply because it has some sort of nexus to communication.
Thank you. Another question, that we could keep you here till next week on this one, but it's a good one. How should we go about ensuring that the Constitution better protects all Americans? Would you support a constitutional convention to rewrite the Constitution to better reflect the modern day United States? Okay, how long you got?
Well, so this is always a tricky question because I am at heart a pragmatist, and there's a part of me that would have always responded to the question of can we do something to change or to improve the Constitution, call a convention, do other things. There was a part of me that would have always said, you know, we shouldn't spend much time on that as an option because it's just not going to happen. But if there's anything that the last few years has taught me, it's that we don't know what's going to happen, and we don't know any longer what is impossible, for better and for worse. We no longer know what the boundaries of the possible are. So my pragmatic approach has been to try to work within the Constitution as it is, and to try to not cede the ground. And by that I mean not give up and say, oh, the First Amendment has to mean what the revenge pornographers say it means, or the tobacco industry says it means. To say, no, we're not going to cede that ground. We're not going to agree to that. We're not going to agree to the NRA's definition of what the Second Amendment is. We're simply not going to say that they're right about this, and we're just going to have to change it or repeal these amendments. So I want to say the Constitution as it is can be interpreted much more fairly and equally, and it has been upon occasion, but that we can't give up on the project of doing that, that we have to make sure that we are willing to say, that's not what the First Amendment says, and to not let anyone tell us that the First Amendment has some kind of eternal meaning that we all just have to understand because the ACLU tells us what it means. And the same thing with the Second Amendment, that these amendments are interpreted by humans, they're written by humans, and they are invested with the values and the lack of attention or very over-solicitous attention to certain types of individuals and concerns, and they can be changed. Now, at the same time, there are many incredibly smart and passionate individuals who have made the case for saying we need an ERA, or we need an equality amendment, we need to change functionally the way that the Constitution is able to deal with equality. And I think that those efforts are extremely important, and that to the extent that those can also be to the extent that we can contribute to those and encourage those at the same time that we don't cede the ground with the Constitution as it is, I think that that is a very useful and good development.
Thanks. If I can grab Chair's privilege for a second, would you worry about a constitutional convention? Because from what I've read, depending on who you do read, once you've got one, everything's on the table. Do you think it could have run off the rails, or do you think it could be managed well?
Again, I guess I'd say all bets are off. I would be concerned, right, if we were to think about what does it mean to put everything on the table, given what we know about where we are as a society and who tends to have more power, and given where we stand in terms of the way that we communicate with each other and the kinds of misinformation and disinformation that we're all swimming in now. It's hard to think that any political or legislative or constitutional process could be protected in terms of its integrity today, which isn't to say or to idealize any of the past ways that we've done this, but I'm even less confident about the ability for the American public to get the information that it needs, to not be subjected to a constant barrage of misinformation and propaganda. I'd be very concerned about what it is that people would want to do, depending on who those people are and how much power they have, what they want to do to the Constitution, right? If now we're thinking it's on the table to think about how it should be done better, what's to say that it's not going to be just basically, you know what, the 14th Amendment was kind of a mistake. Let's get rid of that, or let's make sure that we don't let the wrong types of people bring the wrong types of interests into the Constitution. So I am apprehensive about how that would work itself out.
Thanks. Here's a question from one of our faculty. In Charlottesville, the chant you referenced also alternated with, quote, "Jews will not replace us," end quote. This suggests that it is actually white Christian male supremacy that we're talking about. Does that factor into your analysis?
That's a really astute point, and I think that that's right. I think that one of the defining characteristics that I spend very little time on in the book, but certainly am sympathetic to, is that when we talk about who has power in America, it's not just race and it's not just gender, it's also religion. And that same phenomenon that I describe in my book of victim claiming, this false sense of persecution, we see it really quite overtly when it comes to claims of religious persecution, that we have at the very highest levels of government this constant complaint that Christianity is somehow is under attack and that it must be protected. And that is used very strategically. That sense of false persecution is used to impose any number of measures and practices and policies that truly do turn what should have pretensions to being a democracy into something like a theocracy. And we're seeing that every day. So I am very concerned about that. And I do think that is an accurate point, that's essential to understanding the complexity of interests that are being held in dominance here. Christianity is certainly part of that.
It's okay. Let me see. Is the problem a cult of the Constitution or a cult of an originalist interpretation of the Constitution?
It's both. So I would love to be able just to blame the problems of constitutional interpretation on one school of interpretation, but I do think it is accurate to say that it doesn't matter what perspective one takes. Even people who claim to be anti-originalist, people who really claim that they believe in an evolutionary document, that they believe in progressive constitutionalism, those are very often the same ones that will in the same breath say, but the First Amendment means this and it always has, right? Those are the same people who will say, the First Amendment only protects all speech with the exception of these tiny historical categories, and will never even think about how they have just decided and have endorsed a completely arbitrary version of historical interpretation. So originalism certainly has much more overt ties to religious fundamentalism, right? Very often originalism is saturated with that sort of imagery and that sort of idea that this is a divine language that we simply can receive and does not change, and that is timeless and eternal. But plenty of progressives, plenty of people who consider themselves to be on the vanguard of liberty and equality are making the same mistakes, and maybe just even less honestly so, because they're claiming to think about this in a progressive sense. And somehow, though, when they invoke, or when we look at who the First Amendment, for instance, has mostly protected since its modern inception, it's not really that often the downtrodden and the excluded and the marginalized. It's occasionally the disliked, but it is still primarily the people who have always had power in this country, not people of color. It's not been women. But if you look at Supreme Court cases and the kinds of issues that are brought and the kinds of speech that are advocated for, especially, let's say, in the last couple of decades, it is big corporations. It's people with power saying they need more power. And so I wish we could say that this was just a problem of originalism, but I think it's a problem of general constitutional interpretation when that constitutional interpretation does not have an adequate commitment to equality.
Got one question refers to, you might have followed the Duncan Becerra decision coming out of California this summer, and it asks, what realistic options exist right now to enact substantial gun reform, given the recent adoption of strict scrutiny by the Ninth Circuit in that case in California?
On one level, I'd say that the outlook for getting sensible gun regulations is not great. I don't know if it's worse now necessarily than it was 10 years ago, but it doesn't look good. I do take some comfort in the fact that, at least as far as the Supreme Court goes, the disaster that many thought that Heller was going to be in terms of sensible gun reform has not happened. That the passage in the Heller decision where Scalia goes out of his way to say no right is unregulated, there are all kinds of regulations that we have to respect, just as we do with the First Amendment. And that the court has kind of stuck to that it hasn't been particularly eager to take up questions of, okay, beyond this particular interpretation of the Second Amendment as protecting the individual right to self-defense inside the home, has not seemed really keen to go beyond that. And I do think that this is one of those moments where we need to think less about, not to think less, we shouldn't be hemmed in by what we think the Supreme Court is going to do or what any court is going to do, because again, we're living in very uncertain times. In the absence of any reason to think that you can't pass legislation that would be sensible, that would impose restrictions on people who have clearly indicated that they intend to do violence against other people, people who have a history of domestic violence or other assault, restrictions in terms of age, restriction in terms of ammunition. There are all kinds of creative and useful things that legislatures all across the country could be doing and should be doing, and some of whom are doing, that at least until things get worked out at these ultimate levels would be saving lives, could be saving lives. And the way that the Supreme Court works is the same way as any institution made up of human beings works. Show that something works better, show and convince people that they will be better off with sensible gun regulations, and show them that the alternative is really just hoping and praying that you will shoot first rather than getting shot first. There's a way for us to convince everyone, hopefully, at least the critical mass of people, that there are restrictions that need to be made. And beyond that, not just restrictions that can be made, but that we need to think more comprehensively about what does it mean to defend yourself. If you have a right to defend yourself, what does that mean then every time you have to leave your house and be confronted with someone who, by virtue of showing you his weapon, is telling you, I could kill you at any moment? How secure can you be? How secure can you be in your liberty or your ability to take care of yourself or your family if you have to worry about that everywhere you go? And again, so I think a broader conception, a smarter strategy about how this isn't about restricting gun rights. It's about saying, wait, if people have the right to self-defense, if that's what we actually think the Second Amendment is for, then let's take an actual objective look at who it is who's allowed to defend themselves, who's invoking stand your ground and getting away with it, who is actually able to say, I was doing what I should be doing and should be protected, right? Who is, waking up in the middle of the night and firing at the direction of an intruder, not knowing that that person is a police officer, because why would you know that someone breaking into your house in the middle of the night is a police officer? And say, what about their rights to self-defense? And have a much more comprehensive conversation about what that actually means.
Thanks. Here's a nice spin, and it actually ties back to the opening of your book, I think. Says, did the lasting Enlightenment values of the Constitution contradict the fundamentalist reading of the Constitution? Or is the Bill Clinton quote that, quote, there's nothing wrong with America that can't be cured by what is right with America, end quote, a mere celebration of the cult of the Constitution?
Well, I suppose the interpretation of that quote, I guess there's a few ways that I could take that, to the extent that there's a certain, for lack of a better word, liberal dodge, right? The idea that, well, things are bad, but everything could be fixed. The problem with that, and that's how I'm choosing to take that, the force of that quotation, is I do think that it is an abdication of responsibility in some ways. It doesn't have to be, right? It could be a call, right? It could be saying, look, we could fix this, let's fix it, right? But if it's not followed up with that call to action, if it's more of the, as I expressed it, I think in my book, if you treat equality and all the noble goals of the Constitution as, and you talk about them as an achieved fact, that's the problem. If you talk about them in terms of an aspiration, that is what we need to be heading towards every day, then I'm fully on board with that. And then the question just becomes, what are you going to do about it? Because it's not going to resolve itself, right? And if you are the person in power, if you are the president or a legislator or anyone else who has the power to do something, it is up to you, right? At least you have a very large responsibility to take a very active role in trying to make sure that those problems are fixed. So very much depends on what is meant by that kind of attitude. Does it mean that we're sure that truth and decency and and all the values we claim we care about will win out in the end, I see no reason to think that that's true. Our history up to this point has shown us that power will keep taking power if we let it. So if there's ever going to be a different outcome, it's going to be because people decide that they are going to reject certain grabs for power. They're going to reject certain interpretations of constitutional rights, and they're going to fight to make sure that those people are not in office and don't have power.
Okay, I have several questions. I gotta edit them down a little bit. On the topic of persecution, how can politicians reach out to that group of angry white men who believe they are being personally attacked by liberals and the media?
The caveat that I think that there's a spectrum of angry white men. That is, I want to say that there's a certain point at which I don't think all people necessarily are open to persuasion. I think that by the time you have made certain kinds of commitments, you may not be a person who can be talked back. But I don't believe that that's true of every person. And one of the most fascinating and heartbreaking things about the persecution complex of the white male right is trying to contemplate what it is that's motivating it, right? Here's one story, which is that for as long as most people alive have been alive, they have been accustomed to believing and seeing that people like them, the people in power, white men, have been in power, and it hasn't been questioned, and they've been able to do all kinds of things that are now suddenly becoming criticized, or not suddenly, but it feels as though now there's certain things that just weren't acceptable back then. And what a lot of white men are articulating is that, well, that makes me feel uncomfortable. I don't feel welcome anymore. I don't feel as though I'm assured that people are going to take me seriously or have sympathy for me. And that's a very frustrating thing for people who've actually experienced oppression to hear, because it is this kind of lack of understanding of proportionality, right, between inconvenience or discomfort and actual suffering. And it speaks of a certain type of very privileged individual who can't tell the difference, right? Who can't tell the difference between I'm uncomfortable and I'm oppressed. So the good news is the people who really are just articulating in that early stage of I'm uncomfortable, I think there's a way to talk them through this, right? I think there's a way to say, listen to yourself and what you're trying to say. So you're saying you no longer walk into a room and feel as though people care about what you have to say, and they might criticize you and they might judge you, and you're worried that they might even not like you. Okay, that is a sad feeling. That is something no one likes. Now imagine that that's a feeling that you had to carry around with you all the time, not one than something you could pinpoint as this happened to me today, but it's your entire existence. And it's not just about feeling uncomfortable or that people may not want to hear what you have to say, or they might call you a name. It's that they might kill you, right? Or they might assault you, or they might do you serious harm. So can you, as a person experiencing discomfort for maybe the first time, think about how that makes you feel compounded by imagining that you could never get away from the skin and the identity where people kept treating you that way and treated you as someone to be dismissed or someone to be put down. And then try to say, can you think about that? And can you use this moment of you feeling discomfort and you feeling alienated? And it can be ramped up, right? If you are unemployed, if you can't provide for your family, if you feel ashamed or emasculated, or all of those feelings, and say those are not illegitimate feelings, because feelings are what they are. They're not, we can't say that they're not true as such, but we can put them in context and say, imagine what it's like if someone has to go through everything that you're going through and all of this other suffering and oppression. Do you know what they feel like? And to use your own experience as a bridge to other people. I think that it's possible. I think it's happened to some people on occasion. I think it is definitely something that we should spend more time trying to think about and to hear people first, because no one hears you if you deny their sense of discomfort or their sense of pain. You have to acknowledge it first, whether we like it or not, and then try to talk about how it is that we can use that to understand where we are in the greater context of suffering and oppression and injustice.
Well, we're coming up to our time. We'll get one or two more questions, if that's okay. Here is one. What is the role of higher education, including colleges like Washington and Lee, in constitutional interpretation and constitutional understanding?
Well, it isn't for me to say necessarily what the role should be, but I guess I can give some thoughts about what I wish the role could be. And it's this, there is, in the last few years, there's been such a concerted effort to drag campus conflicts into the national spotlight and say, this is what's wrong with America. So beginning roughly in the 2016 or so, this emphasis on, oh, there's a campus free speech crisis. We have liberal snowflake students who can't handle disagreement. They're trying to erase history, and it all becomes combined with the sense of there's a new culture out there and it doesn't want to hear anything about the greatness of the past. It just wants to ruin everything and take everything down and blow everything up. And what I've described it as in other places is, to oversimplify, I see the norms around discussion and speech and education collapsing. That is to say, they're being replaced. In some sense, the university idealized norms of discussion and civility and education, right, are being pushed aside in favor of internet norms. That is, if you think about the difference between a discussion you have in the classroom, or at least a good discussion you have in the classroom, versus a discussion you have on Twitter, what are the differences? One would hope, at least in the idealized version of a classroom, everyone's done the reading, first of all. You'd also hope that people would let each other talk. And you'd also hope that there wouldn't just be somebody in the middle of the classroom screaming racial slurs the entire time. You'd hope that you'd be able to have some ground rules for discussing the subject at hand, and that there'd be some sort of gatekeeping in terms of, yes, some things are irrelevant, some things are entirely inappropriate. We're going to talk about the actual difficult issues. If you think about the average social media conversation, it's only about immediacy, and it's about polemics, and it's about how can I blink at the other person with completely inappropriate or really offensive language that they just stop talking, right? And the things that you get rewarded for on social media are not thinking, not reflecting, not actually being educated about what you're talking about, and simply complaining that people aren't listening enough to you. They're really at odds with each other. And I'm suggesting that part of the 2016 crisis was really about the invasion of internet norms into the university. And that was partly facilitated by the very people who were drawing all the attention to themselves, right? The Milo Yiannopoulos of the world, who were these internet celebrities who come crashing into universities, not caring about the community, not caring about getting to a substantive discussion of controversial issues, just caring about the spectacle. And then you had that working hand in hand with this very specific agenda to make it seem as though conversations on the university campus were all one-sided and people were being intolerant. And I do think that what we need is the reverse, right? It would be better for all of us if universities would model the behavior that we know is the preferable model for behavior, which is encourage reflection, encourage evidence-based reasoning, encourage people to, yes, be civil to each other, because it's really hard to have an interesting discussion when people can't even be civil. Encourage people to not think that they have to have an opinion about things. Encourage them to make sure that when they do have an opinion, that it's an informed one. And if we actually were able to export institutional educational norms more to social media, I think we'd all be better off. So I would think that that would be one of the ways that we could try to clarify the differences between good conversations and bad conversations, intolerant discussions and tolerant discussions, but just really on the just on the metric of quality, right? Where do you find high quality discussions? If institutions and higher learning can actually provide that context, then we should do everything we can to support that and to try to promote it as a model for the rest of the community.
Oh, 1.5 more questions, if that's okay, we'll be done. So following up on this, how to address students protesting speakers who visit the campus and they don't agree with them?
Well, there's a lot of different ways one can do it. And this is a very lawyerly response, and I apologize, but it depends on the facts of the situation, right? So there are any number of decisions that go into that scenario, right? Why did the university have this particular speaker? Who asked for them to come? Whose money is paying for it? Is the fact that the person is going to be here going to mean that classes are disrupted? Does it mean that scarce resources are going to someone who's not particularly well versed in the issue that they're coming to speak about? Are we spending resources on them and pushing out people who actually could have been interesting for the community? Decisions about, who got to make those kinds of decisions to begin with. So I think all of that matters. I will say that in my own university, I think there was an extraordinary, creative and useful, and I think very admirable way of dealing with this. We had a very controversial speaker who was invited to speak at the University of Miami School of Law that many of our minority students in particular objected to. And what happened before the event took place was the administration and many others sat down to try to talk to the students about the right ways, or the most, I shouldn't say right, the most useful ways to try to express their disagreement with the fact that the speaker was being invited. And what ultimately ended up happening is that these students organized themselves to reserve a lot of the free tickets that were being given to this for this event, and basically emptied out the room, right? So they grab the tickets and they don't show up. So there's no violence, there's no, there's no shouting down, there's just, we're gonna empty out the room. But even more importantly, what they did at the same time was organized a few blocks away, a community building event that celebrated the diversity of the university and of the community, and raised money for causes to help those vulnerable groups within the community. And I thought this was really an extraordinary way to handle it, which is not to say it's the only way to handle it, or that this is the biggest priority that any students need to think about, is how to come up with creative and really labor-intensive ways to counter protests. But I thought it was incredibly impressive, and it always struck me as a shame that incidents like that were never the ones that would make national headlines, right? It was only the ones where who knows who is jumping up and down or shouting at people or causing violence, and that gets used as the justification for showing that students are so intolerant, and other types of responses are simply never talked about, or really just not on the radar in the same way.
Thank you. The half question was, how are we doing on time? But actually, we've essentially pushed our limits. So I'd like to say on behalf of the university, thank you so much for visiting with us virtually. I hope we'll be able to get you here in person to see our beautiful campus on a day that's prettier than today, to tell you the truth. Thanks to everybody who attended. Thank you for all the questions. Thank you to the groups who sponsored this, who are really too numerous to list right now, but you can see it on the poster. And again, many thanks to you, Dr. Franks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Rush.